Thank you, Dr. Barnes. First, I would like to thank the Minority Student Committee in the Department of Human and Organizational Development and the Bishop Joseph Johnson Black Cultural Center, affectionately known to me as the House, for sponsoring this colloquium this afternoon. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for coming out on a rainy Friday afternoon to hear what I have to say relative to iterations of Dominican national identity and the implications of Haiti in such a construction. I must admit that it is quite refreshing for me to witness what I consider to be this evolutionary shift at Vanderbilt, as in my day as an undergraduate student, conversations on race in the form of departmental sponsored lectures in conjunction with the Black Cultural Center was not a part of the intellectual exchange. So this occasion is of great significance to me as an alumnus of this fine institution of higher learning. On that note, it is with great pleasure that I greet fellow Vanderbilt alumni like Ms. Vera, who was in sociology when I was here, as the only African-American graduate student in the doctoral program in sociology. And also, last but not least, I'm very grateful for my dear friend and colleague, Sandra Barnes, for having extended the invitation. It's good to be back at Vanderbilt. It is my intent this afternoon to explore the ideology of race as it is configured and contextualized within the nationalistic framework of Dominicanness. In so doing, I will discuss how such a paradigmatic iteration implicates the manner in which the average citizen in the Dominican Republic sees himself or herself vis-a-vis the rest of the world, in particular her conjoined neighbor, the Republic of Haiti. To conclude, I will present the construction of a contemporary crucible in Dominican society where the refractory ideological material has calcinated and erupted into a nationalistic performative display evoking a skewed anti-Haitian sentimentalism, thank you, skewed by the fact that the pathological treatment of Haiti is nothing close to tender, yet disproportionately visceral. The historical and evolutionary development of national and racial identity has fostered a present-day vilification of Haiti and the Dominican Republic to the point of forging a national discourse that centers prejudicial hostility towards Haiti that manifests within the imagined borders of the neo-slave community, or bate. And I will explain later in the talk this concept of a bate, as you can see from the depiction here with the sugarcane cutter, the Dominican bate. In his exegesis on nationalism entitled Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson states the following in the revised edition relative to the limited spatial conceptualization of defined national territories. And I quote, "The nation is imagined as limited because even the largest of them, encompassing perhaps 1 billion living human beings, has finite, if elastic, boundaries beyond which the nation lie. No nation imagines itself coterminous with mankind." In the painstaking process of mapping, cartographers are challenged when it comes to the axis of geospatial boundaries as one community distinguishes itself from another topographically and territorially. In terms of coterminality, as was evoked by Anderson, of particular intellectual concern is how to deal with this encounter and exchanges that occur as these imagined borders are created. What happens in this period of confrontation at the borderland? And I'm specifically thinking about the constructed border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. How are notions, ideologies of national identity, national cultures mediated as a result of the close proximity of these two nations? The island of Hispaniola stands as a testament to Anderson's postulation of the spatial configuration of nation building, in that an essential understanding of nation is conceptualized within the context of presumed geographical boundaries that separate the Dominican Republic from Haiti. In terms of North America, the U.S., Canada, and Mexico have constructed such boundaries as to protect the confines of the autonomous rule of each nation state. These, quote, gated national communities, unquote, have for centuries attempted to define and contain the core attributes that have distinguished one nation from its bordering neighbor. An observation of note is this play of nationalizing one's spatial domain is the manner in which, or the lengths to which, one nation will go to differentiate itself from the other, especially when they share a common land mass. Scholars generally agree that the concept of nation building in the Americas has its genesis in the 18th century with the American Revolution, followed by the Haitian Revolution. As these new nations began to free themselves from colonial enterprises, the arduous task at hand is akin to launching a new commercial product for global consumption in terms of how these new economies were to package and sell themselves as they entered the marketplace of independent state building. In its construction of national identity subsequent to its liberation from Haitian rule in 1844, the Dominican Republic has a formative history that is lodged in the myths of a selectively imagined identity that valorizes certain moments spanning from its pre to post-colonial history. Thus, the racial politics of contemporary Dominican Republic is one that is steeped in the ideology of historic blanqueamiento, or whitening. From its adoption of a Hispanic indigenous identity and immigration policies under the early Trujillo reign to the current situation with Haiti, this Spanish-speaking Caribbean island has, for her few centuries of existence, promulgated a national racialized identity that has not been congruent with the racial background of its majority population. Mythologized for national and global consumption is the idea that the Dominican Republic is a white nation infiltrated by blacks, or in today's context, Haitians. Interesting to note is that during the late 1840s, following the 22-year of Haitian rule of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, in an effort to seek recognition in the international community, appealed to the United States for solidarity within region along racial lines. Rayford Logan notes in Haiti and the Dominican Republic the following, and I quote, "During the late 1840s, the Dominican government appealed to the United States for recognition, largely on the ground that it was a white nation. But American special agents, even after counting, quote, white Negroes, unquote, and, quote, Negroes with a white heart, unquote, were unable to find enough white people to justify recognition. One agent, obviously seeking to support the request for recognition, guessed that in 1845 that there were 4,000 Negroes, 90,000 colored people, and 100,000 whites." However, noted Latin American historian George Reed Andrews in Afro-Latin America 1800 to 2000, published in 2004, states that circa 1800, blacks or people of African ancestry in the Dominican Republic constituted 66% of the total population at the beginning of the 19th century. Fast forwarding to the year 2000, Reed Andrews states that blacks and mulattoes constitute 84% of the total Dominican population. Yet, the myth of Hispanidad and whiteness still remains pervasive in the Dominican concept of national and cultural identity. To unpack these ideologies, the notion of Hispanidad in the Dominican Republic is the nation's effort to preserve its colonial Spanish heritage in terms of language, religion, and presumed race. Eclipsed is the memory of African and Black migration to region from colonialism and slavery to the present day. Additionally, the desire to portray herself as a non-Black nation state has surpassed the once coveted indigenous-based national identity conceptualized on the ancestry of the native Taino people. Thus, like many emerging nations in the Americas during the 19th century, ontological iterations of subjecthood became an exercise in construing mythologies that would come to define a people, a geographical territory, a culture, and a nation state. In his Myths and Memories of the Nation, Arthur Anthony B. Smith engages the importance of myth and memory in the creation of national identity. Smith states, and I quote, "What gives nationalism its power are the myths, memories, traditions, and symbols of ethnic heritages and the ways a popular living past has been and can be rediscovered and reinterpreted by modern intelligentsias," unquote. Smith's assertion centers the national discourse that has surrounded how the Dominican Republic has attempted to market herself globally as largely a white Spanish Caribbean nation under the guise of the ethnic myth of Hispanidad. In so doing, the Dominican Republic erects an illusionary border from its neighboring Haiti that reinforces the binary instead of moving beyond it. Created in the Dominican national imaginary is the contextualized construction of a nationalist discourse that can be interpreted as anti-Haiti, as the Dominican Republic imagines herself to be that which the perception of Haiti is not in the Western Hemisphere and beyond, white, civilized, and Catholic. Regarding the anti-Haitian sentiment that shapes contemporary race discourse, Latin American political scientist Ernesto Chagas states, and I quote, "The case of anti-haitianismo in the Dominican Republic is particularly poignant as it has added an intra-island dimension to these Hispanophile dominant ideologies. Anti-haitianismo ideology combines a legacy of racist Spanish colonial mentality, 19th century racial theories, and 20th century cultural neo-racism into a web of anti-Haitian attitudes, racial stereotypes, and historical distortions. Not only does this ideology affect Haitian immigrants in the Dominican Republic, but it has also traditionally been employed as an ideological weapon to subdue the Black and mulatto dominant lower classes and maintain the political quiescence," unquote. This mid-19th century national ideological posture set into play the relationship that is affected in today's context between these two sister nations, and the crucible where the race relation between the two is hyperbolically played out is the creation of the Bate community, replete with this complex historical development. However, in order to understand the contemporary racial politics in 21st century Dominican Republic, we must journey very briefly to two significant conjoined periods in the country's history: the emancipation of slaves and Dominican independence. The abolition of slavery and the presumed Dominican independence are two historic moments that are met with competing emotions and sentiments of nationalism. Historians such as Frank Moya Pons account that the emancipation of the enslaved was accompanied by Haitian rule of the Dominican Republic in 1822, as Dominican alignment with Haiti was a result of conjoined forces positioning in fear of French opposition in Martinique. So again, when we talk about the history between the Dominican Republic and also Haiti, we have to understand that there was some concerted effort between these two nations upon the Dominican Republic becoming free of colonial rule because of what's happening in the circum-Caribbean space relative to France, and the fear that the Dominican Republic would once again be recolonized by French because of Haiti's success in defeating the French with her revolution, there was this forging of a merger between these two governments as the Dominican Republic became somewhat of as Haiti became somewhat of a protectorate of the Dominican space to evade further colonialism. However, the Dominican Republic soon found herself under direct rule for the next 22 years until February 27, 1844. In the cerebral imagination that shapes the political ethos of the Dominican Republic, the 22 years of Haitian rule has been a persistent threat to Dominican sovereignty and has served as a basis for what has become a national racialized discourse that continues to separate the two sister island nations, as Haitians are contextualized in the Dominican imaginary as that barbarous element of which the Dominican Republic tried to rid herself in terms of a symbolic reminder of her Black African heritage. For many in the Dominican Republic, many who deal with the racial politics of the Dominican Republic see Haiti as the Achilles heel of the Dominican Republic, in that she serves as that mimetic representation of Blackness in the entire island of Hispaniola, particularly in the Dominican Republic. And acknowledgement of an African past would be counterintuitive to her present discourse relative to the national epistemology of Dominicanness, meaning that if the Dominican Republic were to embrace her history of Black migration to space, then at risk would be this historical posturing of the Dominican Republic as largely a white Hispanic nation. Thus, Haiti is needed in order to fuel this antagonistic relationship between these two bordering nations. In the words of Cornel West, and I paraphrase, that which manifests in present-day Dominican Republic is the residual of, quote, psychological violence, unquote, whereby Dominicans have been socialized to repudiate a central component of their racial heritage in light of how that component has been vilified globally. Thus, the treatment of Blackness in the Dominican Republic can be reduced to the manner in which Africa has been mythologized by Western imperial powers. So powerful are these contextualizations that they dictate the global understandings ascribed to Africa and her diaspora, contributing to a self-fulfilling prophecy as African descendants in nations like the Dominican Republic begin to indoctrinate such epistemologies into their nationalistic comprehensions of Blackness. That is, Dominicans have come to believe that Blackness is equated to barbarism, that element in modern society and postmodern society that impedes civilization. Thus, in their attempt to evade the truth of their misogynized African heritage, the Dominican Republic as nation has engaged in psychological projection whereby the burden of its disdain has been cast upon those deemed to be the true Blacks of Hispaniola, these being Haitians. And the contemporary presence of Haitians in the country fuels this anti-Black discourse as the projected discordant image of Haitians in the Dominican public sphere incites this continual antagonistic relationship between the two. As alluded to earlier, the evolutionary history of the contextualization of race and discourses on whitening and anti-Haitianism in the Dominican Republic is evidenced within the intra-nationalistic borders of the constructed Bate community. It can be argued that the creation of this intra-nation space is purposed to contain that which has contaminated the purity of Dominican national and cultural identity. At this juncture, I would like to offer the following YouTube clip as an introduction to a further understanding of the Bate community in the Dominican Republic, as seen in this short entitled Haitian Exportation in the Dominican Republic.
But not far away, there is a place few tourists ever see. A place of unrelenting toil and brutal exploitation. These are Haitian migrant workers. Their numbers estimated at between 500,000 and 1 million. A cheap labor source for the Dominican sugar industry. They work 15 or 18-hour days, chopping, carrying, loading, and reloading mountains of raw sugar cane.
This is the hardest work you can imagine.
Sugar is one of the Dominican Republic's most important industries. While scenes like this may appear almost like something out of an earlier century, the sugar rendered from this cane is part of the globalized world economy. It'll be shipped straight to the United States. Last year, the U.S. imported 185,000 tons of Dominican sugar, worth $74 million. Very little of that money filters back to workers like 18-year-old Joel Batiste. He arrived in the cane fields a month ago, smuggled in illegally from Haiti by a labor broker. He and his younger brother, desperate to earn some money for their family, were promised jobs in construction. They wound up cutting cane instead.
It's very tough work, but I don't have any other option.
The work is backbreaking. The sun and the humidity are unbearable. And the pay is pitifully small. For all their labor, these men will earn, on average, about $3 a day.
The workers live in appalling conditions in company shanty towns called batais. Here, housing consists of primitive cement block shacks. There's no running water, just a single pump. And medical care is rudimentary at best. We met this man with a severe injury to his hand. It was cut right down to the bone in an accident from the cane field, but he got no medicine to prevent infection.
I still have to work, even with this wound, because if I don't, I don't eat.
The Haitian migrants face constant racial discrimination and violence. As non-citizens, they have few rights under Dominican law. Sonia Pierre is a human rights campaigner.
We are being deprived of our civil and political rights. It's as though we don't exist, and we are dead citizens.
Danielle Alexis knows the cycle of debt and poverty very well.
I've been cutting cane for more than 30 years.
He thinks he's about 60, too old to cut the cane anymore. In all his life, he's never once seen a doctor or a dentist or even used a telephone.
I live as God sees fit.
Citizens of nowhere living an existence of bitter hardship in fields of sugar. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic.
So as you can see, as depicted, this gives you some idea of what life is like and in the Dominican bateys, where the Haitian cane workers are subjected to just inhumane conditions. As alluded to earlier, the evolutionary history, with regards to the historical development of the batey, it is important to understand that both governments, through the signing of the 1952 bilateral acuerdo, or agreement, legitimated the entrance of Haitians into the Dominican Republic for the purpose of working in the sugarcane fields. Under this collaboration, Haitians were to be imported as seasonal workers for a 5-year period. It is recorded that 2 other 5-year agreements were signed between both governments in 1959 and 1966, respectively. The latter of these 2 agreements expired in 1971, and no new bilateral agreement has been established to date. Instead, the Dominican government entered into an annual contract of migrant Haitian workers that lasted until 1986, which is the year of the downfall of the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti. However, despite the non-existence of a signed agreement or an annual contract, thousands of Haitians are smuggled into the Dominican Republic to work the cane fields as depicted in the clip that you just saw. Under the bilateral agreement signed between these two nations in 1952, 1959, and 66, the Haitian government was to supply transportation for these migrant workers, while the Dominican government provided housing and a base salary for their labor. Haitians were to reside in camps near to the fields that consisted of dwellings that were to be furnished with beds, chairs, tables, electricity, running water, sanitary facilities, and common dining grounds. At the end of the harvest season, Haitian migrant workers were to be repatriated until the beginning of the next season. For many Haitians brought or smuggled illegally to the Dominican Republic, their fate would be slave-like conditions that bear testament to the nation's view of Haiti and Haitian immigrants. In her 1989 Human Rights Watch report, Haitian sugarcane cutters in the Dominican Republic, Maurice Fontou states the following, and I quote, Although slavery in the Dominican Republic was formally abolished over a century ago, Haitians in that country continued to be delivered at gunpoint to work on government-run plantations. Like their ancestors brought from Africa, they are forced to labor against their will, cutting sugarcane for armed Dominican masters, unquote. The metaphor evoked by Fontou's initial comments is that of neo-slavery in the Americas, sanctioned by government-run facilities that exploit people for economic gain. In this scenario, Haitians are the enslaved and Dominicans become the masters in the reenactment of colonial master-slave paradigm of old. Bearing numerous similarities to the chattel slave system, Haitian sugarcane workers in the Dominican Republic find themselves relegated to the restricted confines of their neo-slave quarters, referred to in Spanish as el bate. So the translation of el bate, it's a concentration camp-like community that is specifically constructed for these Haitians in order to ensue a segregationist type aesthetic that for our sentimentality can be linked to somewhat of a Jim Crow-like segregationist strategy and or an apartheid-like type of government that sit right in, that's in the Dominican Republic. And then it's interesting to note that in this construction, there is very little to almost no integration between Dominicans and Haitians. And there is also a tiered system about which I will speak later that kind of engenders the segregationist aesthetic that we see happening at the Batays. Due to the socio-political and economic situation in Haiti, hundreds of thousands of Haitians are lured to the Dominican Republic in an effort to work and find economic gain. Haitians are enticed to enter illegally with promises of well-paying jobs. Once they arrive, they find themselves imprisoned within this neo-slavery system with little to no chance of escape. They are recruited in Haiti by buscones, longtime Haitian workers who can no longer cut cane. Once in the Dominican Republic, these Haitian migrants are subjected to subhuman living conditions, disease, continued poverty, social marginalization, economic exploitation, and national displacement as they become subjects without a nation to claim as their own. Generations of these cane cutters exist in the Dominican Republic as sin patria, countryless subjects belonging to neither Haiti nor the Dominican Republic. Although born and raised in the Dominican Republic, many that make up this disenfranchised population today are not provided documentation that would allow civil status as Dominican nationals. Haitian workers remain confined to the Bate, caught within a vicious cycle of systemic poverty, hopelessness, and abuse. Once they are brought to and born on these plantations, physical force like that used during slavery is what compels them to cut cane and to submit to the Dominican power-based hierarchy. it's important to stop here to just talk a little bit about the notion of generational Haitians who are born in the Dominican Republic within the confines of the Bate. We're talking about subjects who are born not with the cognizance of what or who or what Haiti is, who have no ideological understanding of what it means to be Haitian, as they are born in the Dominican Republic, born speaking Spanish and born socialized within this amalgam, this cultural amalgam that exists, that is neither Haitian and also neither Dominican. Relative to education in the Bates, typically there is little to no education, as my grandmother would say, once a child is knee-high to a duck, she or he is sent into the cane fields in order to labor. The structure of the Bate community consists of two types, the Central and Agricula. As an extension of the cane field, the Bate Central is the community for largely those who process the sugarcane once cut and weighed. And interestingly, there is a distance. How many have been to the Dominican Republic or have seen or have been to a Bate? There is typically some spatiality relative to these two types of systems, as to the fields and the processing center. Typically in the fields, we're talking about the Haitian population, and in the processing centers, we're talking about the Dominican population. And for me, it brings to mind Gilberto Freire's notion of Casa Grande and Senzala, which talks about this dialectic that exists in Brazilian society between the masters, slaves, the big house, and the shanty town. So when you're in the Dominican Republic and you're visiting these bates, it gives you this colonialist type of illusion that is at place in a 21st century context. Typically, a majority of the inhabitants of the Bate Central are Dominicans, whereas, as I mentioned, Haitians make up approximately 85% of the population residing in the Bate Agricula, harvesting the cane. The structure of the Bate Agricula consists of three classifications of workers. One, los viejos, the former cane cutters, or the old people, the former cane cutters who have lived in the Dominican Republic for many years and are now too old for such strenuous labor. The second category are the cangos, the recent recruits, and finally, the braceros, the seasoned cane cutters, many of whom were born in the Dominican Republic. They live in barracones, or barracks, consisting of a long row of single rooms made of concrete or wood with no electricity or running water. Many of the barracones date from the colonial era, where they served as slave quarters. The hygienic conditions with which the workers are forced to contend are a discussion among countless human rights organizations and groups. These communities are laden with tuberculosis, diarrhea, malaria, all resulting from unsanitary conditions. Haitian children working the cane fields are in violation of Dominican labor law, which forbids minors less than 14 years of age to work. Additionally, Article number 229 of the Dominican Labor Code provides that, quote, the employment of minors less than 18 years old in dangerous or unhealthy labor is prohibited, unquote. Thus, the condition of the average Haitian found in the Dominican Republic is peppered by historical and ideological iterations that attribute to how Dominicans have contextualized understandings of race and nation vis-a-vis Haiti. Cemented within their constructions lie Haiti, the geofractional denominator testifying vehemently to the amnesiatic historical identity of the Dominican Republic as being steeped in blackness. And what I mean here is that Haiti surfaces continually as a symbolic reminder of the history of the migration of Africans and African descendants into the part of Hispaniola that is now known as the Dominican Republic. In short, what exists today in the imaginary of most Dominicans is the notion that the nation-state ideologically represents one whose heritage is largely Hispanic, namely white. Such a position has caused a sense of self-hatred among the Dominican people that fosters a selective amnesia relative to the overwhelming history of Africans and Africa-descended people within the nation. This ideological blanqueamiento, or whitening, has created a racial politics where a binary exists in black and white. Dominicans are white, and by extension, Haitians are black. The psychological projection of blackness onto the Haitian population in the Dominican Republic has afforded a slippery slope for contemporary Dominican national identity formation, which resonates with historical anti-Haitianist discourse. The current neo-slavery situation in the Bate only serves to add fuel to the perennial racial fire and further divide two people and two nations inhabiting one island. Furthermore, the current day Bate becomes the locus where Dominican race and national performativity morphs into a national and racial discourse that has at its core anti-black, anti-Haitian sentiments. Thus, the contextualization of race in the Dominican Republic becomes a nationalist project whereby it is constructed within a historical binary engendered by the historical moment of 1822. Since 1844, 1822 marks the beginning of what's considered the Haitian domination of the entire island of Hispaniola. Since, in 1844, when the Dominican Republic frees herself with Haitian, the Dominican Republic undergoes this process by which it tries to eradicate blackness from all of its epistemologies relating to nation and national identity. And the ideological mechanism used for this undertaking is ensconced in the historical whitening of nation in terms of how Dominicans see themselves and how they wish to project a reflection of self onto the global world. The nucleus of the protoplastically constructed nation is iterations of anti-Haitian discourse. I have to apologize, I just got braces, so I'm learning how to speak again, and somehow it's just not coming as quickly as I would like it to. Therefore, by way of a conclusion, I think that the Dominican response to contextualizations of race and discourses on nation, national identity, and Haiti are best illustrated visually in the following political caricatures from the Dominican press as provided by Ernesto Sagas in Race and Politics in the Dominican Republic, published in 2000 by the University of Florida Press. If we could, can you all read this? So we can see with the first one, a huge black hand, which represents Haiti, threatens to engulf the Dominican Republic. A white Dominican waves a stop sign, alto, and this is by permission. So again, this is fueling this notion that Haiti and that what all she represents is encroaching upon the national sovereignty and the identity of the Dominican Republic. In the second one, we see a white Dominican makes fun of the allegations by international human rights organizations that Haitian children work in the Dominican sugarcane fields. And the caption in Spanish, "Qué barbaridad, que aquí lo que trabajan son niños," where how awful, though there are children working here. And as you can visually see, that we have what is referred to as a child in the form of a full-grown Haitian man. Again, talking about the way Haitians are configured in the Dominican imaginary. Just a couple more. In this one, a poor Haitian migrant tries to enter the Dominican Republic, but is stopped by a big white hand. So again, this dialectic relative to how the Dominican Republic sees herself and how she sees Haiti as this barbarous element that basically is a threat to her civility and a threat to her definition and understandings of civilization. And the one at the bottom, the Dominican Republic tries to run away from Haiti, this separatist type of ideology, to where the Dominican Republic sees herself as totally free of this. As you can see here, I want to show you clearly how the feet of Haiti are painted black and the feet of the Dominican Republic are white, again, fearing into this binary of a black Haiti and a white Dominican Republic. Finally, the political caricatures have to do with the election that was in 1994, and I happened to be living in the Dominican Republic during this time when Piña Gomez, who was at the time what we would consider the mayor of La Capital, Santo Domingo, the largest city in the Dominican Republic, made his first attempt to become president of the nation state. And fueling the Balaguer regime was the notion that Piña Gomez was of Haitian ancestry, and as a result, if he were to be elected president of nation, then they would revert back to the 1822 aesthetics when Haiti ruled the entirety of Hispaniola. He made a subsequent attempt he being Piña Gomez, made a subsequent attempt to run for president years later, and the same anti-Haitian rhetoric emerged and cost him that election. Interesting to note that he served for years as the mayor of La Capital, Santo Domingo, in the Dominican Republic. And I'll just show you one more, and it goes to an anonymous fax that was sent with a drawing of Hispaniola full of Haitians, which would be the result if Piña Gomez were to have been elected president of the Dominican Republic. And it's interesting how the U.S. is implicated here. It says that con el apoyo del Clinton y los países europeos, Piña es un peligro. Cuidado. Be careful with Piña Gomez. So I'd like to conclude here, basically, and just field any questions that you may have. For many of you, I see that one person who visited the Dominican Republic, this type of batik construction is still alive and well, where if you were to go to outlying areas of La Capital, Santo Domingo, or if you were to go into areas of Samaná, you will still see manifestations of these type of existence of Haitian cane cutters that are working in the Dominican Republic. Thank you so much for your attention, and if you have any questions, I will try my best to be a little bit more articulate as I learn how to work my way around this metal in my mouth. Yes?
How has the earthquake influenced this?
Yeah. It has actually influenced it gravely, as can be imagined, that many Haitians sought refuge in the Dominican Republic post the earthquake. Interestingly, according to some good friends in Cuba, that many Haitians also went to Cuba, and they were met with some of the same type of anti-Haitian rhetoric when they were received, actually, by the Cuban government. So again, there is this fear of how to protect the borderlands. When you were in the Dominican Republic, did you by chance go to Nacogón, to the border city between It was very interesting because during the earthquake, there was an attempt to control this area of the Dominican Republic. Why? Because historically, there had been lots of commerce occurring at the border in this particular city between Dominicans and Haitians. You have Dominicans that are living on the Haitian side who have married Haitians. You also have Haitians living on the Dominican side who have also married Dominicans. So this one little border town has become the nucleus of understanding how this nation is really trying to deal with her historical past, as the Dominican Republic is really trying to, again, as I mentioned at the top, it's trying to really clean its house relative to ridding itself of the influence of Haitians and the migratory movement of Haitians into the Dominican Republic. Yes?
Your presentation is wonderful. You've done an excellent job of describing the binary and all the problems that come out of the binary notion of race here, but I wanted to add a third point into this ideology and how race is imagined in this community, and that's our own imagined community of race, because most of us, when we see this video, we see members of the African diaspora, whereas a lot of those people would say, I'm an Indian, I'm Indio.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to comment, if you could, on how the Dominicans in the United States and living in this imagined community change how race is imagined in their own former community in the Dominican Republic. I'm thinking right now of, do you know Diaz's
Absolutely.
The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, for example?
Very good question. How many of you have read Gino Diaz's work, either Drown or The Brief Wondrous Life? How many of you have read works by Nelly Rosario, or even works by Angie Cruz, or works by Lorna Maritza Perez, who wrote this wonderful novel, The Geographies of Home? This is where literature has what I consider the incredible capability of engaging sociological, psychological, even thoughts relative to trauma that emerge in dealing with this issue of how one sees or imagines him or herself. Specifically to your question, I'm reminded of Chiqui Viciosa, who talks about her entrance into the United States in the 1970s to study at the University of SUNY Buffalo, where upon coming into the United States, she was asked to fill out her document forms, and she had to indicate what her race was, and she wrote India. And this is in the 1970s. India coming from Indio, that's where the professor comes out, where Indio, this concept of what it means to be Indian or indigenous. And this myth of racial construction is based on the notion of the Taino people who were a part, the Taino, the Arawaks, and other indigenous groups that occupied this landmass before the coming of Columbus and colonialism. Therefore, as a way of opting out of a black aesthetic relative to their identity, many Dominicans adopted this notion of Indio in all of its variations. You can be you can be an India Clara, if you're a woman, a light-skinned Indian. You can be an India Oscuro, which is a dark-skinned Indian. So again, these are the levels to which talking about typologies relative to racial identity construction that Dominicans went to in order to evade the notion of being classified as black. And so Chiqui said that when she wrote India and gave the form to the US immigration official, he looked at it, looked at her, scratched it out, and wrote what? Black. And it was the first time, she states, that she had ever confronted a notion of being black or being an African-descended person. I remember in a class that I taught relative to US Afro-Latino literature and another course on Afro-Latin American literature, I had a Dominican young woman, graduate student in my seminar, who basically, during the course of the seminar, for the first time, engaged her blackness, because it is something that is not taught relative to the formative educational years of Dominicans. Dominicans are taught based on the myth of Enriquillo, the native person, that they are descendants of this indigenous construction. However, Manuel Zapata Oliveira, in talking about this tripartite construction of the Latin American, he is one of the few scholars who talks about how to embrace the three major components of Latin American identity: the European, the African, and also the indigenous. What happens in situations like the Dominican Republic, what happened early on in the United States as well, with the construction of octoroon societies, mulatto societies. It did not last here in a in a North American context, because of the proverbial one-drop rule, that in the United States, one drop of black blood deemed you black. In other areas of the Americas, one drop of any other blood gives you an out of blackness, of which many citizens took. And this is what we find happening in the Dominican Republic relative to the construction of this Indio identity. Yes?
I just wanted to add to what you said. Another aspect about this is that Trujillo was the first person to force Dominicans to call themselves Indians.
Yes, in the 1930s.
Yeah, so when you look at the census today, or any of the identification card for Dominicans is called a cedula. It's basically like a combination between your social security number and your driver's license. There's no option of black, that's not there.
Exactly.
You have to put Indio
Absolutely.
or white. So even if you're a Dominican, there's, in Santo Domingo, the capital, there's a lot of movements that are pro-black,
Yes.
identifying themselves as Afro-Dominican rather than Indio. And they're trying to remove this I from the cedula. But yeah, and if you go there, there isn't a discussion because the government does not allow for that discussion.
Absolutely. And what's fueling that discussion are Dominican diaspora subjects who have come to the United States, who have gone to Europe, who have gone to other geographical spaces, and have had to be forced to contend with their blackness because their configuration of whiteness does not resonate within those geographical or those nationalist constructions of what it means to be white in the other country outside of the Dominican Republic. You're absolutely right about the cedula, and also these movements have begun since in the Dominican Republic, particularly in La Capital, since the 1970s. So they have been ongoing, and it's interesting, your comment relative to, evoking the Trujillo regime of the 1930s was not just in the Dominican Republic. For those of you who know the history of Mexico and the forging of a national education trajectory, it happened in Mexico with the whole notion of what? The mestizo with Vasconcelos and the creation of this cosmic race. So when we look at what's happening within the Circum-Caribbean as well as these new emerging early 20th century nations, this repudiation and this miseducation of the national relative to blackness is at play, not just in the Dominican Republic, not just in Mexico, but in places like Uruguay, where there was a black population, not much slavery in Uruguay, Paraguay, but relative to the movement and shifts of people from Brazil, from Argentina, and other spaces as well. Yes?
Are there any mitigating factors in the racial dynamics you've talked about? I'm thinking, for example, the role of language. If you're Haitian but speak Spanish, does that matter? If you're wealthier and black, does that matter?
Yeah, two things resonate upon hearing your question. The notion of, and I'm sure the Dominican probably understands what I'm about to write, the notion of perigil. How many have read Edward Dante Kant's The Farming of Bones? Getting back to the question of language, Dominicans and Haitians, dark-skinned Dominicans and Haitians were massacred as a result of their inability to pronounce the word in Spanish, parse, perigil. If the pronunciation had any hint of the Vila pronunciation of the French R, you were massacred on the spot, machete. So this notion of language and pronunciation and defining language as a cultural mechanism for defining one as Haitian and or Dominican has been in place since the 1930s massacre. And it continues to play. Many are saying, to borrow Julius Wilson's oftentimes misunderstood work, The Declining Significance of Race, where he looks at race relative to, and many I'm speaking to sociologists who probably know this work better than I, where he looks at this notion of how ideologies of race plays out among a certain population of the African American community, meaning middle-class African Americans, middle-class whites, what they have in common more so than anything, to where in their psyche of the average white middle class, that race is important, but also is being mediated. Your question raises lots of intellectual thought relative to this notion of can one circumvent race through class? Does it mean that because you are educated, then you're not black? Because you have some type of social standing, then that opts you out of blackness. And I'm thinking about a Brazilian context where Pelé becomes an iconoclastic representation of this ideology of one circumventing blackness as a result of social mobility, economic gain, and also how the larger society tries to configure you once you become a national icon that has what? Global appeal, that has global appeal. Much like what people are having to do with the US and blackness now that President Obama is the quote-unquote iconographic representation of power. People are having to go back and to reassess these epistemologies that they have relative to blackness in the same way that folk had to deal with notions of black Brazilians upon seeing, upon hearing, and upon embracing Pelé and the likes of Pelé. Dr. Martin.
Can you talk a bit about what are the implications of the large mulatto community?
Yeah.
Are they serving as a bridge, or do they result in even more contestation because of what they do or do not represent?
Yeah, as the young gentleman intimated, when we're talking about that population on the island, there is no such thing as a mulatto community. They are white. They are white. They majority consider themselves white. And therefore, when we use nomenclatures and typologies that we deal with within our own racial politics within the United States, those ideologies are not transferable when we look at
so the table that you have there, though, that was, again, an outsider categorizing.
Absolutely, absolutely. George Andrew Reed's is, yeah. And it's based on Mills's notion of eyeballing. You know, that if you look at someone, you look at them, you try to kind of deconstruct them phenotypically, and then you check based on your understandings of race and racial identification, which is a very slippery slope when dealing with Latin America. Yes?
This paradigm you discuss here, how does it impact how Dominicans view their other neighbors, specifically for their closest neighbor, Puerto Rico?
Yeah, it's interesting in the sense that if the U.S., how do I want to phrase this? The Dominican Republic probably would be what Puerto Rico is today if the success of the U.S. intervention in the Dominican Republic, as well as in 1965 when the U.S. basically went back into the Dominican Republic and basically became the governing body of that nation due to political unrest. You had the decline of the Tahitian reign, you had lots of political unrest happening in the 1960s that precipitated a U.S. intervention or invasion in the Dominican Republic again in the 20th century. I think that we know the history relative to the Spanish-American War, the whole notion of what happened to Puerto Rico as a result of treaties that were signed, which ended that conflict, which should have been the Cuban War of Independence. But when we look at the configuration of the Dominican Republic, honestly, it just was not in the political interest of the U.S. at the time in order to seize, because we have to understand that there is reciprocity when the U.S. gets involved, and we see that with what has happened now with Puerto Rico. We have to ask the question, did the U.S. want to intervene in this geographical space, knowing our own, and this is when we have to be politically honest and emotionally honest, knowing our own histories relative to racial segregation, racial politics in the U.S., would it be in the best interest of the U.S. to deal with this nation that visibly represented a second Haiti, a second black nation? Would it have been in the 1960s after the signing of the civil rights? And these are hypothetical. These are questions with which we have to contend in order to contextualize these understandings. Would it have been and the best interest of the United States in the 1960s to embrace the Dominican Republic in the way that she embraced Puerto Rico at the beginning of the 20th century, when we're coming out of our own travails relative to racial politics. There's a lot that we have to consider historically. Yeah, and particularly in Juno Diaz's work and the work of Nelly Rosario, these are Dominican diaspora writers. The ideological shifts are happening not just on the island, but more so in the diasporas, where these writers, Haitian diaspora writers, Dominican diaspora writers, are beginning to write about this terse relationship that has existed historically between these two bordering nations. And I think that's going to be resolved in the diaspora as well. Yes, Dr. Barnes.
This is actually an extension of what you just were talking about. Given that the DR is whitening itself at the expense of Haiti, can you chat a little bit about how Haitians are responding? You know, what's their take on race relative to the way in which the DR is presenting itself? Well,
we know at the beginning of the 19th century, with the success of the Haitian Revolution, that Haiti actually declared herself the first black nation in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, it's very clear to Haitians as to who and what they are. However, this notion of blackness has been skewed in the sense that a majority of what we see. Have any one of you been to Haiti? It's very interesting because the Haitians that we typically envision, well, what we envision when we think of a Haitian subject is not necessarily, and what I want to consider an essentialized aesthetic of who and what Haitians are. Haitians span the spectrum relative to color, yet we only see the darkest of Haitian, which is equated to the poorest of Haitian, which is equated to the most illiterate of Haitian. And again, we have to dislodge that to understand what is actually happening when we get these globalized images of who and what represents this nation that has a history of miscegenation, as does every other nation in the Americas, including our own. And so oftentimes it's very difficult for us to think of, when we look at people in this room, we see the history of miscegenation in the United States and the physical manifestations of miscegenation in in tonalities of skin, in bone structures, in textures of hair, all of this. And so oftentimes, because we have been socialized not to be sensitive to these wonderful, unique peculiarities that we share in the Americas, we have been socialized to somewhat be blinded to this as a result of either you are black or you are white, and whatever those constructions mean, because they are mythologized constructions.
I would say that hopefully in this space, many of us have been challenging
I hope so,
ourselves relative to that issue.
Yeah.
What I'm talking about is, again, given the fact that Haiti's presenting itself as black, then what are, again, how is that nuanced? You mentioned, of course, the tonality, et cetera.
Yeah, Haiti has a ruling elite and has had a historical ruling elite that many other spaces in the Americas would not say that they are, quote unquote, black as a result of a phenotype. However, many of us in the States would not say that they are white as well. So again, Dr. Barnes, when we talk about how race is nuanced and how race has been historically nuanced in the Americas, in space, particularly spaces like the Caribbean, the French, Spanish Caribbean islands, and Central and South America, we have to be cognizant to the fact that their evolutionary socializations relative to typologies, relative to the way people have come to define themselves, sometimes is in direct opposition to the way we have historically done it in North America. Yes?
I just want to point something out. There are instances where, like this anti-Haitian picture that is often studied is there. It's mostly something that the capital city has sponsored and the ruling elite. But if you listen to a lot of merengues from the 90s and 80s, you hear Haitian Creole in the merengues by Dominicans who are singing it. So there is a certain degree of acceptance that musically, it's evident musically by the Cibao region, which is the northern region of the Dominican Republic, and the border area. There's always been this interaction, like you said, about economically with Dajabon. When you talk to people in that region, you definitely see an acceptance to the neighbor next door. They make fun about the way it sounds because they don't understand it. But the fact that they sing, if they hear the song in Dominican song, they hear Haitian in it, they sing it.
Yeah.
So I think that indicates a certain degree of acceptance that the capital city would never have.
Yeah, I would challenge that though, because oftentimes we are programmed to sing and hear things that we do not engage intellectually in order to understand what that really means for me. And also to the level that, yes, you are absolutely right, that in the form of music and other type of popular culture manifestations, you do see this type of cultural melange between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. However, it has not risen to the fact that it is now an iteration of a nationalist discourse in the Dominican Republic. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, thank you again so very much.